It is tempting when we speak of existentialism to think of a sudden flash of insight in the 20th century, a movement that erupts fully formed in the cafes of Paris or the lecture halls of Copenhagen. Yet the roots of that movement sink deep into the soil of early modern thought, into the uneasy moments of the Enlightenment, and into the romantic yearning for authenticity. In this first segment, we will walk together through the precursors and the birth of existential thought, tracing a line from the 17th century French mathematician, theologian Blaise Pascal, through the 18th century Genevan philosopher-novelist Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to the Danish pastor-philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, whose own personal turmoil helped to shape the very questions that would later become the hallmark of existentialism. Consider Pascal, a man who spent his early years as a prodigy of mathematics, discovering the properties of the cycloid, inventing the first mechanical calculator, and yet whose later life turned inward toward the mysteries of faith and the human heart. In his scattered notes, the Precedes, he writes, "The heart has its reasons which reason knows not." This short, poetic statement is not merely a romantic flourish. It is a declaration that there exists a mode of knowing that lies beyond the strict calculus of logic, a mode that feels, that doubts, that trembles in the face of the infinite. Pascal's famous wager that we may bet on God's existence because the potential gain outweighs any loss is often reduced to a clever piece of probabilistic reasoning. But if we listen closely to the Precedes, we hear a deeper anxiety, the awareness that the human condition is suspended between the finite and the infinite, between certainty and doubt, between the comfort of reason and the unsettling silence of the void. Imagine for a moment a person standing on a cliff at twilight. The horizon stretches endlessly and the wind whispers of possibilities that cannot be measured. The rational mind might calculate the distance, the angle, the probability of a safe landing. Yet the heart, the cur, feels the pull of the abyss, the fear, the awe. Pascal captures that tension, and it becomes a seed of existential angst, a recognition that human beings are always already situated in a world that cannot be fully captured by universal formulas. Now turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, a generation later, would take up the mantle of exploring the self in a different direction. Rousseau's Confessions is, in many ways, the first modern autobiography that insists on the raw, unvarnished presentation of the self. He writes, "I have been the most honest of all men because I have not pretended to be what I was not." In this confession, Rousseau does not merely recount events, he performs an act of self-creation, laying bare his desires, his failures, his yearning for authenticity. He declares that the true self is not something given by society, but something that must be excavated, even if the excavation reveals uncomfortable truths. Rousseau's emphasis on authenticity resonates with the romantic ideal that the individual must listen to the inner voice, even when it conflicts with the expectations of the state, the church, or the market. He famously argued that civilization corrupts the natural goodness of man, that the social contract is a necessary but tragic compromise. In doing so, Rousseau plants a seed that will later blossom into the existential insistence that each person must confront the conditions of their own existence, must own the choices that define them, and must accept the loneliness that such ownership entails. Both Pascal and Rousseau, though separated by time and geography, share a common thread. They sense a fissure between the world of universal reason and the lived experience of the individual. Pascal sees the limits of rational calculation when confronted with the infinite. Rousseau sees the limits of social convention when confronted with the inner call of the self. Their writings, though not labeled existential, already anticipate the central concerns of existential thought. The anxiety of freedom, the weight of responsibility, the search for meaning in a world that offers no ready answers. It is here that we encounter the first major counterargument, one that would dominate the Enlightenment and continue to echo through the 19th century. The claim that universal reason, the rationalist project, can dissolve existential angst. Think of Immanuel Kant, whose critique of pure reason asserts that the structures of the mind impose order upon experience, that the categories of understanding guarantee the possibility of knowledge. From this perspective, anxiety is a temporary misapplication of reason, a failure to recognize the proper limits of human cognition. If we could only align our judgments with the universal principles of logic, the existential dread would evaporate, replaced by the calm certainty of a rational world. Yet Pascal and Rousseau would respond, each in their own way, that reason alone cannot account for the lived pulse of existence. Pascal's wager is itself an appeal to a kind of pragmatic reasoning that acknowledges the limits of knowledge. Rousseau's Confessions is a refusal to let rational categorization erase the messy interiority of the self. Their works suggest that anxiety is not a flaw to be corrected, but a condition to be faced, a symptom of the human being's encounter with freedom and finitude. A second, equally powerful counterargument comes from the Scottish philosopher David Hume, whose skepticism about the self challenges the very foundation upon which existentialism would later build its focus on individual subjectivity. Hume famously declares that when we introspect, we never encounter a stable, enduring self, but only a bundle of perceptions, fleeting and ever-changing. In his treatise of human nature he writes, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I find nothing but a perpetual flux and movement." If the self is merely a collection of fleeting impressions, then the existential claim that each person must own their choices becomes problematic. What is it that owns them? The existentialists would not ignore Hume's insight. Kierkegaard, for instance, would argue that the self is indeed a synthesis, a unifying relation between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. He would claim that the self is not a static thing, but a dynamic process, an ongoing act of becoming. In this way, existentialism does not deny Hume's observation of flux, but rather embraces it, seeing the very movement of the self as the arena in which authenticity is forged. To understand how these philosophical currents intersected with the turbulent history of their age, we must turn to the concrete events that shaped the lives of these thinkers. The year 1848, known as the Year of Revolutions, swept across Europe like a sudden storm, toppling monarchies, igniting nationalist uprisings, and stirring the aspirations of countless individuals who demanded freedom. In the German states, in France, in the Italian peninsula, the masses rose in protest against the old order, seeking to claim a voice in the political destiny of their nations. This wave of collective revolt mirrored, on a societal scale, the existential revolt of the individual against the given, against the constraints of tradition, against the deterministic narratives imposed by authority. The 1848 revolutions, though ultimately suppressed in many places, left an indelible mark on the cultural imagination, reinforcing the idea that freedom is not a passive gift but a hard one, constantly contested project. Parallel to these public uprisings, we find a more intimate, personal revolt in the life of Søren Kierkegaard. Born into a prosperous Copenhagen family, Kierkegaard was expected to follow in the footsteps of his father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, a successful businessman who hoped his son would assume the family trade. Yet the young Søren felt a pull toward theology, toward a life of contemplation and critique. When he finally announced his intention to become a pastor, his father, who had long envisioned a different future for him, withdrew his financial support. In a letter, Michael wrote, "I have always thought that you would become a merchant, not a preacher. This decision is a betrayal of our family's expectations." The break was not merely financial, it was existential. Kierkegaard's personal crisis forced him to confront the gap between the expectations of the world and the call of his own conscience. This rupture became the crucible for his later writings on the leap of faith, the stages of life's way, and the agonizing choice between the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Kierkegaard's own context, Denmark's Lutheran tradition, the rise of modernity, the growing influence of scientific rationalism, provided fertile ground for his critique of the prevailing Hegelian system. He saw in Hegel's grand historical narrative a tendency to dissolve the individual into the universal, to reduce personal experience to a mere moment in the unfolding of the absolute. For Kierkegaard, the individual's relationship with the divine could not be mediated by abstract logic. It required a subjective, passionate commitment, a leap that defied systematic proof. In this sense, Kierkegaardian existentialism is a direct response to the rationalist claims we have just examined, a reminder that the lived experience of faith, doubt, and choice resists being fully captured by universal categories. Let us pause now to consider how these early precursors reverberate in the work of later thinkers. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing several decades after Pascal, would launch a scathing critique of the very theodicy that Pascal offered. Nietzsche famously declares, "Is it not a sign of the decadence of the Christian moral order that the believer would rather wager on God than confront the abyss of meaninglessness?" He sees Pascal's wager as an act of cowardice, a surrender to an imagined authority rather than an affirmation of life's inherent value. Nietzsche's God is Dead proclamation can be read as a radical extension of Pascal's anxiety. Where Pascal feels the terror of the infinite, Nietzsche feels the terror of its absence, and both see the human being caught in a crisis of meaning. Conversely, Martin Heidegger, in his seminal work Being and Time, would turn his philosophical gaze back to Rousseau, interpreting his notion of original forgetting, ursprüngliches Vergessen, as the fundamental human condition of being thrown into the world without a prior awareness of its own being. Heidegger argues that Rousseau's emphasis on returning to nature, on rediscovering the authentic self, anticipates the existential project of uncovering the forgotten question of being. In this reading, Rousseau's Confessions becomes not just a literary experiment, but a philosophical act of confronting the thrownness that Heidegger later names Geoffenheit. Thus, the romantic pursuit of authenticity finds a new philosophical articulation in the phenomenological analysis of existence. We have now assembled a tapestry of ideas, anecdotes, and counterarguments that together illuminate the birth of existential thought. Let us revisit the concrete examples that anchor this narrative. First, Pascal's Pensées, a collection of aphorisms, fragments, and reflections, offers us the famous passage: "We know the truth not only through reason but also through the heart." This line captures the duality of human cognition, the tension between the calculable and the felt, and it invites us to consider that the heart's reasons are not irrational whims, but a distinct mode of understanding that speaks to our deepest concerns about existence, purpose, and mortality. Second, Rousseau's Confessions provides a vivid illustration of the self-portrait as a philosophical act. In the opening pages, Rousseau writes, "I am a man, and I have a history. I have lived a life, and I have a story to tell." By foregrounding his own experiences, his childhood in Geneva, his love affairs, his philosophical wanderings, Rousseau declares that the personal narrative is a legitimate source of philosophical insight. He does not merely recount events, he interrogates them, asking how they have shaped his sense of freedom, his feelings of guilt, his yearning for a more authentic existence. In doing so, he models the existential method of turning inward, of examining the lived experience as a site of meaning. These two texts, though separated by nearly a century, converge on a common point: the recognition that human beings are always already situated in a tension between the universal and the particular, between the demands of reason and the urgings of the heart. They teach us that the quest for authenticity, for a true understanding of oneself, cannot be resolved by abstract systems alone. Instead, it requires a willingness to sit with anxiety, to confront the possibility of meaninglessness, and to make choices that define us even when those choices are fraught with uncertainty. Now let us examine more closely the two counterarguments that we introduced earlier and see how they continue to challenge existential thought. The first, Enlightenment rationalism, rests on the belief that the development of universal principles, mathematics, logic, natural law, will ultimately dispel the darkness of human anxiety. Kant's categorical imperative, for instance, proposes a universal moral law that all rational beings can recognize. If such a law existed, then the individual would never be left alone with the weight of moral decision. The moral landscape would be clearly mapped, and the existential dread of freedom would be replaced by the certainty of duty. But existentialists argue that even a perfectly rational moral law cannot erase the fact that we are finite beings confronting an infinite horizon. The categorical imperative presupposes that we can act according to a principle that is both universal and self-legislated, yet it does not address the feeling of being thrown into a world without a predetermined purpose. Kierkegaard's notion of the anxiety of possibility, angst, captures this, the awareness that we are free to choose and that each choice carries the weight of defining who we are. This anxiety persists even when we have a clear rational framework. It is a condition of freedom itself. The second counterargument, Hume's skepticism about the self, challenges the existential focus on personal authenticity by questioning whether there is a stable self to be authentic. If the self is merely a bundle of fleeting impressions, then the project of owning one's choices becomes a linguistic exercise rather than a substantive claim. Hume's observation that there is no impression of self forces existentialists to refine their concept of the self. Kierkegaard answers by proposing that the self is a relation, a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, an ongoing act of becoming rather than a static entity. Later, Jean-Paul Sartre would take this further, declaring that existence precedes essence, meaning that we first exist as a stream of experiences and only later define ourselves through the projects we undertake. In this way, the existentialist acknowledges Hume's insight about flux, while still affirming that we are responsible for the directions we choose in that flux. Having examined these philosophical debates, let us return to the historical anecdotes that give flesh to the abstract. The revolutions of 1848, with their banners of liberty, equality, and fraternity, were not merely political events, they were existential proclamations. When a worker in Vienna raised a flag and shouted, "We are the masters of our destiny," he was echoing the same sentiment that Kierkegaard would later describe as the subjective truth that must be lived, not merely thought. The failure of many of these revolutions to secure lasting change underscores a paradox. The human desire for freedom is relentless, yet the structures that resist it are deeply entrenched. This paradox mirrors the existential tension between the yearning for authenticity and the weight of societal expectations. Kierkegaard's personal break with his father, on the other hand, illustrates the intimate scale of existential revolt. Imagine a young man raised in a comfortable household, suddenly faced with the prospect of losing his financial support, his social standing, and perhaps even his familial love. The decision to pursue a path of faith and philosophy becomes a moment of existential choice, to remain in the safety of the familiar or to step into the uncertainty of a vocation that demands personal conviction. This personal drama, played out in letters and diary entries, becomes a microcosm of the larger philosophical question: what does it mean to live authentically when the world around us insists on a different script? Both anecdotes, public and private, reveal the same underlying dynamic. The individual, whether a mass of citizens or a solitary thinker, is called upon to confront the possibility of self-determination, to make a choice that defines their relationship to the world. The existentialists would later describe this as the moment of decision, a point where the abstract concepts of freedom and responsibility become lived realities. Let us now trace the line from these early precursors to the later thinkers who would expand, critique, and transform their ideas. Nietzsche, as we noted, takes Pascal's wager and turns it on its head, accusing the wager of cowardice. He writes, "The greatest event of recent times, that God is dead, is already being felt in the trembling of the human heart, which no longer can hide behind the safety of a wager." Nietzsche's proclamation forces us to reconsider the role of faith, not as a refuge from anxiety, but as an affirmation of life's power in the face of meaninglessness. He also critiques Rousseau's romantic ideal of the natural man, arguing that the return to nature is not a path to authenticity, but a retreat from the responsibility of creating values in a world without divine guarantee. Heidegger, meanwhile, rereads Rousseau through the lens of phenomenology, suggesting that Rousseau's emphasis on the original forgetting of being is a precursor to the existential analysis of Dasein, the being that is aware of its own existence. Heidegger's notion that modern humanity has forgotten the question of being, that we have become absorbed in technological enframing, can be seen as an extension of Rousseau's warning that civilization leads us away from our authentic selves. In this sense, Rousseau's romantic yearning for a return to the original state anticipates Heidegger's call for a rethinking of the foundations of human existence. Kierkegaard, situated between these two later giants, offers a unique blend of personal narrative, theological reflection, and philosophical analysis. His concept of the leap of faith is not a blind abandonment of reason, but an acknowledgement that the deepest truths of existence lie beyond the reach of pure logic. He writes, "Subjectivity is truth, meaning that the truth of one's existence is lived, felt, and chosen, rather than merely deduced." This claim resonates with Pascal's insistence on the heart's reasons and Rousseau's self-portrait as an act of self-discovery. Yet Kierkegaard also pushes further, insisting that the individual must confront the abyss of despair that arises when the self fails to align with the ethical or the religious. In sum, the precursors to existentialism, Pascal's anxiety about the infinite, Rousseau's quest for authenticity, the historical upheavals of 1848, and Kierkegaard's personal rebellion, form a rich tapestry of ideas and experiences that set the stage for the later development of existential thought. They illustrate a fundamental shift, from the confidence of Enlightenment universalism to a recognition of the individual's solitary confrontation with freedom, meaning, and mortality. As we reflect on these early thinkers, we might ask ourselves, what does it mean for us today to sit with the heart's reasons, to write our own confessions, to make a leap of faith in a world that still offers both the promise of rational order and the specter of existential dread? The answer perhaps lies not in finding a final resolution, but in embracing the very process of questioning. In the words of Pascal, the heart has its reasons which reason knows not. In the words of Rousseau, I have been the most honest of all men because I have not pretended to be what I was not. And in the words of Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards. But it must be lived forwards. These three voices, echoing across centuries, invite us to sit in the quiet space between reason and feeling, to acknowledge the anxiety that arises when we confront our freedom, and to recognize that authenticity is not a static achievement but a continual act of becoming. The birth of existential thought, therefore, is not a single event but an ongoing dialogue, a conversation that began with Pascal's pen, continued with Rousseau's diary, was sharpened by the fires of revolution, and was deepened by Kierkegaard's personal crisis. It is a conversation that we, as listeners and thinkers, are invited to join, each time we pause to ask ourselves what it truly means to exist. When we turn our gaze toward the first stirrings of existential thought, we inevitably encounter the solitary figure of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian-philosopher who, in the mid-19th century, dared to proclaim that truth is not a matter of abstract system, but of lived subjectivity. Imagine a world in which philosophy had become, in the eyes of many, a grand edifice of logical deduction, a towering Hegelian system that promised to reconcile every contradiction within a single, all-encompassing whole. Into that atmosphere stepped a man who whispered, almost defiantly, that the most important truths are those that reside in the depth of the individual's heart, that they cannot be captured by any universal formula, and that they demand a personal, even paradoxical leap. This is the essence of what we call the Christian existentialist tradition, and it is here that Kierkegaard plants his flag. Kierkegaard's project begins with a radical redefinition of what it means to be a philosopher. He insists that philosophy is not, first and foremost, a discipline of logical proofs or metaphysical speculation, but a discipline of existence itself. In his own words, subjectivity is truth, and truth is subjectivity. The emphasis on subjectivity is not a turn towards solipsism, as some critics would later accuse him, but an invitation to each person to own their own existence, to confront the anxiety that arises when the crowd's comfortable certainties dissolve. This anxiety, which he calls angst, is not simply fear of something specific. It is the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that appears when we recognize that we are the authors of our own choices. To understand this anxiety, we must first consider the three stages of life that Kierkegaardian philosophy outlines: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. These stages are not merely chronological phases, but qualitatively distinct modes of being, each with its own way of relating to the world and to oneself. The aesthetic stage is the realm of immediate pleasure, of sensory gratification, of the pursuit of novelty. It is the world of the young man in either /or, who delights in music, in fashion, in the fleeting thrill of a lover's kiss. He lives for the moment, and his life is a series of choices that aim to avoid boredom, to keep the heart racing. Yet beneath the surface of this hedonistic freedom lies a subtle emptiness, a sense that the pleasures are never sufficient to fill the void that the self feels. The ethical stage, by contrast, is the realm of responsibility, of commitment, of the recognition that we are bound by moral law and by the expectations of the community. It is the world of the judge who decides, for example, that marriage is not merely a contract of pleasure but a covenant of duty. Here, the individual moves beyond the self-indulgent "I want" to an "I ought," and thereby begins to confront the weight of the universal. Yet even this stage for Kierkegaard is not the final word. It still leaves the question of the absolute, of the ultimate source of meaning, unresolved. The religious stage is the final movement, the place where the individual stands before the paradox of the divine. It is here that the famous image of the Knight of Faith emerges, most dramatically illustrated in fear and trembling. Abraham, the biblical patriarch, is called upon by God to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. The ethical demands of the world, love for one's child, the promise of the covenant, stand in stark opposition to the divine command. The Knight of Faith, however, does not resolve this tension by rational compromise. Instead, he makes a leap of faith, that suspends the ethical in favor of the absolute trust in God. Kierkegaardian faith is not a calm assent to doctrine. It is a trembling, passionate, absurd commitment that defies the logic of the crowd. In either /or, Kierkegaard presents the aesthetic seduction of the young man through a series of essays and letters, most famously the Diary of a Seducer. The young man, Johannes, is a master of charm, a connoisseur of music, a lover of the arts. He fashions his life as an endless series of aesthetic experiences, each one a fleeting triumph over boredom. He tells his lover, "I am a lover of the present, a lover of the moment, and the future is but a promise that I will not keep." Yet, as the narrative unfolds, we see that his pursuit of the aesthetic ultimately leads to a profound sense of alienation. He cannot find lasting satisfaction because the aesthetic stage, by its very definition, denies the possibility of permanence. The story of the young man thus serves as a vivid illustration of the limits of a life lived solely for pleasure. Contrast this with the Knight of Faith, whose story is not told through a series of diary entries, but through a theological meditation. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is not a rational calculation. It is an act that defies the ethical order. When Abraham lifts the knife, he does so not because he believes the universe will reward him, but because he trusts utterly in the absurd promise that God will somehow fulfill the covenant even after the sacrifice. Kierkegaard writes, the Knight of Faith is precisely the one who is able to go beyond the ethical, to the religious, to the absurd. The absurd, for Kierkegaard, is not a mere logical contradiction, but the point at which the finite human mind confronts the infinite, where faith must be a decision made in the face of uncertainty. These two examples, Johannes the Seducer and Abraham the Knight, serve as twin poles of Kierkegaard's analysis of human existence. They are not merely literary illustrations. They are philosophical experiments designed to expose the conditions under which the self can either dissolve into the crowd or rise above it through a decisive act of will. The seducer's life, though rich in experience, ultimately collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. The knight of faith, though burdened by anxiety and dread, discovers a depth of meaning that transcends the ethical. Yet Kierkegaard's radical emphasis on the individual's subjective relation to truth did not go unchallenged. One of the most formidable objections came from the camp of Hegelian systematic philosophy. Hegel, whose dialectical method sought to integrate all contradictions into a higher synthesis, viewed Kierkegaard's insistence on the irreducibility of the individual as a kind of incoherence. Hegelian thinkers argued that if truth is a universal, then any claim to a private, subjective truth threatens to undermine the very possibility of rational discourse. They would say, how can we speak of truth at all if each person is free to define it for themselves? In other words, Kierkegaard's existential individualism appears, from a Hegelian perspective, to be an abandonment of the very rational structure that makes philosophy possible. Kierkegaard anticipated this criticism, and he responded not by offering a new systematic proof, but by turning the critique back onto the notion of system itself. He wrote, "The greatest danger to man is the desire to be a part of the crowd, to lose his individuality, and thereby to become a mere cog in the machinery of the universal." For Kierkegaard, the Hegelian system, with its promise of totality, is itself a form of the crowd that threatens to swallow the individual's authentic self. The irony is that the Hegelian objection, in demanding universal coherence, may inadvertently reinforce the very crowd conformity that Kierkegaard warns against. A second line of critique emerged from the Marxist tradition, which, in the latter half of the 19th century, began to sharpen its focus on material conditions and class struggle. Marxist thinkers argued that Kierkegaard's preoccupation with personal faith and existential angst ignored the concrete socio-economic forces that shape human life. They would ask, is it not a luxury to contemplate a leap of faith when the working masses are struggling for bread? From a Marxist perspective, the emphasis on individual religious commitment could be seen as a diversion from the collective struggle for emancipation. It risks turning the gaze inward, away from the structural injustices that produce alienation in the first place. Kierkegaard's reply to this Marxist critique is subtle, because he lived before Marx's ideas fully crystallized into a systematic critique of capitalism. Yet his writings do contain a keen awareness of the social dimensions of anxiety. In The Sickness Unto Death, he describes despair not merely as a personal psychological condition, but as a sickness that afflicts the self when it is disconnected from its proper relation to the divine. He writes, despair is the sickness of the spirit, the disease of the soul, and it is a disease that can only be healed by the living God. While this language may seem to sidestep material concerns, it also suggests that the root of despair lies in a spiritual disorientation that cannot be fully remedied by economic reforms alone. In this sense, Kierkegaard's focus on the interior life can be read as an attempt to locate a deeper source of human suffering, one that persists even when material conditions improve. To appreciate the full weight of Kierkegaard's ideas, we must also consider the historical context in which he wrote. The year 1843, when either or was first published, was a period of intense national romanticism in Denmark. The Danish cultural scene was awash with a longing for a glorious past, an idealized folk tradition, and a collective national identity. In this atmosphere, Kierkegaard's insistence on the individual's solitary journey was a radical departure. He was, in effect, swimming against the tide of a culture that prized communal narratives and shared myths. Either was not merely a philosophical treatise. It was a cultural provocation, a declaration that the true story of humanity is not the story of nations, but the story of the single, trembling soul. Kierkegaard's polemic with the Danish church adds another layer of tension to his work. He was a devout Christian, yet he fiercely criticized the established church for its complacency, its tendency to reduce faith to ritual, and its willingness to accommodate the state's authority. In his pamphlet, The Present Age, he lambasted the church for becoming a society of the indifferent, for offering comfort without demanding the existential commitment that true faith requires. He famously wrote, "The church has become a sanctuary for the comfortable, a refuge for the lazy, and a tomb for the dead." This critique was not merely theological. It was a personal attack on the institution that wielded immense social power in Denmark. It earned him enemies among the clergy and the academic establishment, and it contributed to his reputation as an outsider, a lone voice crying out in the wilderness. These historical anecdotes illuminate the stakes of Kierkegaard's philosophy. He was not a detached ivory tower thinker. He was a man deeply embedded in the cultural, religious, and political currents of his time, and his writings were a direct response to the pressures he felt from those currents. The publication of either Slash or amidst the fervor of Danish romantic nationalism and his public quarrel with the church demonstrate that his existential concerns were lived, contested, and profoundly personal. Now let us return to the core concepts themselves and examine how they interlock. Subjectivity, as Kierkegaard frames it, is the mode through which truth is appropriated. It is not merely a perspective, but the very condition of being able to claim a truth as one's own. The leap of faith, then, is the decisive movement that transforms subjectivity from a mere internal feeling into an existential commitment. It is a leap because it cannot be arrived at through rational deduction. It must be undertaken despite the lack of certainty, precisely because certainty would reduce faith to knowledge, and knowledge, for Kierkegaard, belongs to the ethical and the aesthetic, not to the religious. Anxiety or angst is the emotional accompaniment of this freedom. When we recognize that we are free to choose, that there is no predetermined path that guarantees safety, we encounter a profound dread. Kierkegaard writes, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." It is not a pathological condition to be eliminated, but a signpost pointing toward the necessity of an authentic decision. In The Sickness Unto Death, he distinguishes between different forms of despair. The despair of not being aware of having a self, the despair of not willing to be oneself, and the despair of unwillingness to be willing. Each of these is a different manifestation of the same underlying condition, the self's failure to align with its authentic source. The stages of life, aesthetic, ethical, religious, serve as a map of how individuals can navigate this anxiety. The aesthetic stage attempts to avoid anxiety through distraction, through the pursuit of pleasure. The ethical stage confronts anxiety by embracing responsibility, by acknowledging the weight of one's choices in relation to universal moral law. Yet even the ethical stage cannot fully resolve anxiety, because the ethical itself remains within the realm of the finite. Only the religious stage, by making the leap of faith, offers a resolution that transcends the finite and embraces the infinite. This is why Kierkegaard insists that the religious stage is not merely a higher ethical, but a fundamentally different mode of being. To bring these ideas into the contemporary world, consider the modern phenomenon of career choice anxiety. A young graduate stands at a crossroads, faced with a plethora of options. A high-paying corporate job, a startup venture, a non-profit role, or perhaps a period of travel. The aesthetic impulse might urge the graduate to chase the most exciting, most novel experience, to avoid the dread of a static life. The ethical impulse might call for a responsible decision, perhaps choosing the stable, well-paid job to support a family. Yet many feel that even the ethical choice leaves a lingering sense of incompleteness, a whisper that something deeper is missing. In Kierkegaardian terms, this whisper is the call toward the religious stage, a call not necessarily to a religious doctrine, but to a personal commitment that aligns one's deepest values with one's life's direction. The leap might be the decision to leave a secure job and pursue an artistic calling, fully aware that the path is fraught with uncertainty. The anxiety that accompanies this decision is not a flaw to be cured, but a sign that the individual is confronting the very freedom that makes authentic existence possible. Another contemporary illustration can be found in the realm of political activism. Imagine a citizen who feels compelled to join a protest movement against systemic injustice. The aesthetic temptation might be to stay comfortable, to enjoy the safety of everyday routines, to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. The ethical perspective might argue for responsible civic participation, such as voting or writing letters to representatives. Yet some activists experience a profound inner urgency that cannot be satisfied by conventional political channels, a sense that they must act in a way that may even conflict with law, risking personal loss for a higher cause. This is reminiscent of the Knight of Faith's willingness to suspend the ethical for a higher divine command. The activist's decision to risk imprisonment, for instance, can be read as a modern echo of the leap of faith, a willingness to embrace uncertainty and potential sacrifice because the cause is perceived as transcendent. The anxiety that arises in this moment, the fear of consequences, the dread of failure, is the same existential angst that Kierkegaard described. Cross-referencing Kierkegaard's ideas with later existentialists enriches our understanding of the evolution of the theme. Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, famously coined the term bad faith, mauvaise foi, to describe the human tendency to flee from authentic freedom by adopting false roles, by lying to oneself about the nature of one's own choices. Sartre's bad faith can be seen as a secular counterpart to Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage. Both involve a denial of the responsibility that comes with freedom. Yet, Sartre departs from Kierkegaard by rejecting the religious stage altogether. For Sartre, there is no leap of faith to a transcendent source. Authenticity must be achieved solely within the human sphere. This divergence highlights a crucial tension in existential thought. The question of whether authenticity requires a grounding in the divine or can be fully realized within a secular framework. Albert Camus offers another perspective, especially in his notion of the absurd. Camus acknowledges the irrationality of the universe, much as Kierkegaard does in his concept of the absurd leap. However, Camus refuses to resolve the absurd by invoking faith. In the myth of Sisyphus, he writes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," suggesting that we can find meaning through rebellion and the conscious embrace of the absurd without turning to God. Camus's secular reinterpretation of the leap can be read as an echo of Kierkegaardian courage, the willingness to act in spite of the lack of ultimate justification. Both philosophers share a deep respect for the human capacity to confront the void, but they diverge on the final answer, faith versus defiant affirmation. Kierkegaard's influence also resonates in the work of later theologians such as Paul Tillich, who spoke of the courage to be as the act of affirming one's existence in spite of existential anxiety. Tillich's notion of being itself as the ultimate ground parallels Kierkegaard's idea that the self must be anchored in the divine to overcome despair. Even in contemporary psychology, the concept of existential anxiety draws heavily on Kierkegaard's early articulation of angst as a fundamental condition of human freedom. Let us revisit some of Kierkegaard's own words to feel the texture of his thought. In Fear and Trembling, he writes, "To be a Christian is not a matter of belief, but a matter of existence." In Either/Or, the aesthetic writer declares, "I have lived my life as a series of possibilities, and I am content to let the world decide what I become." And in The Sickness unto Death, he poignantly observes, "Despair is the sickness of the spirit." It is the condition of the soul that has lost its relationship with the living God. These quotations illuminate the central tension that runs through his oeuvre, the movement from possibility to commitment, from the fleeting to the eternal. When we consider the Night of Faith, we must also confront the paradoxical nature of faith itself. Faith, for Kierkegaardian thought, is not a calm acceptance of doctrine, but a passionate inwardness that embraces paradox. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is not an act of cruelty. It is an act that reveals a deeper trust that the divine will not ultimately betray its promises. The paradox lies in the fact that the ethical demand to protect one's child is in direct conflict with the divine command. Abraham's resolution is not to find a rational compromise, but to suspend the ethical in favor of an absolute trust that defies human logic. This suspension is what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. It is a concept that continues to provoke debate. Can any moral system allow for the suspension of universal ethical norms? For Kierkegaard, the answer is yes, but only when the individual is willing to bear the weight of the absurd. The young man's aesthetic seduction, on the other hand, illustrates how the aesthetic stage can become a self-imposed prison. His endless pursuit of novelty leads to a shallow existence, a life of immediate gratification that never satisfies the deeper yearning for meaning. He tells his lover, "I am a man of the moment. I cannot be bound by tomorrow." Yet Kierkegaard suggests that the aesthetic life is inevitably a life of despair in its own right because it refuses to confront the deeper questions of purpose. The aesthetic seduction, therefore, is not merely a harmless pastime. It is a form of self-deception that masks the underlying angst. The interplay between these two narratives demonstrates the dialectic that Kierkegaard sets up between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. The Night of Faith and the young man are not merely characters. They are archetypes that embody the two possible responses to the human condition. The knight embraces the absurd, the young man flees it. In the end, Kierkegaard does not claim that one can simply choose the religious stage without undergoing the prior stages. He insists that the individual must first experience the aesthetic and ethical, must feel the anxiety that those stages produce, before the possibility of the religious leap can appear. This progression mirrors the developmental arc of many existential narratives, the journey from carefree youth through moral responsibility to a profound, often unsettling, encounter with the ultimate. To bring these ideas back to the present, imagine a modern student faced with the decision to pursue a lucrative career in technology versus a vocation in social work. The aesthetic impulse might draw the student toward the flashy allure of a startup culture, the promise of rapid advancement, the excitement of new gadgets. The ethical impulse might appeal to a sense of duty, to help others, to provide stability for a family. Yet the student may feel a deeper, more unsettling call, perhaps a sense that the work they are drawn to must align with a personal conviction about the world's meaning. The decision to study social work, despite lower pay and greater uncertainty, could be seen as a contemporary leap of faith, a commitment that places personal conviction above societal expectations. The anxiety that accompanies this choice, the fear of financial insecurity, the worry about societal judgment, is precisely the Kierkegaardian angst that signals the presence of authentic freedom. In evaluating the Hegelian objection, we might ask, does the existence of a universal system necessarily invalidate the authenticity of personal faith? Hegel himself acknowledged the role of individuality within the absolute spirit, suggesting that the individual finds its true self in the unfolding of the universal. Yet Kierkegaard would counter that the universal can become a cage if it demands conformity at the expense of personal commitment. The tension between universal rationality and personal subjectivity remains a live debate in contemporary philosophy of mind and ethics. Some modern thinkers, such as Charles Taylor, have attempted to reconcile the two by arguing that authentic identity formation occurs within communal narratives, not in isolation. Kierkegaard's insistence on the solitary leap, however, reminds us that even within communal frameworks, there must remain space for the individual to confront the absurd and make a personal commitment. The Marxist critique also invites a nuanced response. While it is true that Kierkegaard's focus on personal faith may appear to neglect material conditions, his analysis of despair suggests that spiritual alienation can persist even when economic oppression is alleviated. In The Sickness Unto Death, he writes, "The greatest sickness is the sickness of the spirit, which no material remedy can cure." This observation anticipates later existential Marxists, such as Herbert Marcuse, who argued that alienation is not solely a product of capitalist exploitation, but also of a deeper loss of meaning. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the inner life can therefore be read as a complement, rather than a contradiction, to materialist analyses. The two perspectives may be integrated by recognizing that human flourishing requires both just material conditions and authentic spiritual or existential grounding. Returning to the historical anecdotes, we should reflect on the impact of Kierkegaard's polemic with the Danish church on his later thought. His experience of being marginalized by the very institution that claimed to embody Christian faith reinforced his conviction that authentic Christianity must be lived, not institutionalized. In his later work, Practice in Christianity, he argues that the Church's complacency is a betrayal of the very message of Christ, which demands a personal, radical commitment. This stance anticipates the later Protestant emphasis on personal relationship with God, but Kierkegaard pushes it further, insisting that the relationship must be accompanied by the willingness to confront the absurd and to endure the existential anxiety that such a relationship entails. The publication of either Slash or Amidst Danish National Romanticism also highlights the cultural tension between collective identity and individual authenticity. While the Romantic movement celebrated the folk spirit, the collective myths, and the national soul, Kierkegaard's work insists that the soul of the nation cannot be fully expressed through collective myths. It must be lived by each individual. The aesthetic writer in either Slash or even critiques the romantic idealization of the past, suggesting that the pursuit of aesthetic pleasure can become a form of escapism from the responsibilities of the present. This cultural clash underscores the timeless relevance of Kierkegaard's warning that societies, in their quest for cohesion, may inadvertently suppress the authentic self. As we draw these threads together, it becomes evident that Kierkegaard's thought is a tapestry woven from philosophical rigor, theological depth, literary imagination, and cultural critique. His core concepts, subjectivity, the leap of faith, anxiety, and the stages of life, are not isolated ideas but interdependent strands that together form a vision of human existence as a dynamic, tension-filled journey. The Night of Faith and the Young Man serve as narrative anchors that illustrate the possibilities and perils of each stage. The counterarguments from Hegelian systematic philosophy and Marxist materialism provide a critical dialogue that forces us to examine the limits of individualism and the role of socio-economic context. The historical anecdotes remind us that Kierkegaard's ideas were born in a particular cultural moment, yet they continue to resonate because they address universal human concerns. In contemplating Kierkegaard today, we might ask ourselves, what does it mean to make a leap of faith in a secular age? Can the concept of the leap be reinterpreted as a commitment to a cause, a relationship, an artistic vision, even in the absence of a deity? The answer may lie in recognizing that Kierkegaard's leap is fundamentally an act of embracing uncertainty, of choosing to affirm a path despite the lack of guarantee. Whether that path leads to God, to a political ideal, or to a personal vocation, the structure of the decision remains the same. The anxiety that accompanies the choice is not a defect to be eliminated, but a sign that we are truly free. Finally, let us listen once more to Kierkegaard's own voice, as if he were speaking directly to us across the centuries. He says life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. In this simple yet profound statement, we hear the call to acknowledge our past, to recognize the stages we have traversed, and to step forward with the courage to make that decisive, existential leap. Whether we find ourselves standing on the precipice of a career decision, a moral dilemma, or a spiritual crisis, the echo of Kierkegaard reminds us that the authenticity of our existence depends not on the comfort of consensus, but on the willingness to confront the absurd, to sit with our anxiety, and to choose, in the depth of our subjectivity, the path that most faithfully reflects who we truly are. The story of existentialism's secular turn begins not with a sudden rupture, but with a slow, almost imperceptible widening of the horizon that had been circumscribed by Christian doctrine. By the mid-19th century, the philosophical landscape was already humming with the question of whether meaning could survive the erosion of traditional faith. It was in this fertile, uneasy atmosphere that two German thinkers, Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, stepped onto the stage, each in his own way radicalizing the existential themes that Kierkegaard had first articulated, but doing so without the safety net of a divine guarantor. Their work would become the dark, storm-tossed sea into which later existentialists such as Heidegger and Camus would cast their own lifeboats. Schopenhauer's project, as set out in The World as Will and Representation, begins with a startling metaphysical claim: that the world we experience is merely a representation, a veil cast over a deeper, blind, striving force he calls the will. He writes, "The world is my representation. My body is the object of my will." In other words, the subject and the object are one and the same at the deepest level, and the will is the thing in itself that underlies all phenomena. This will is not rational, not purposeful in any teleological sense, but an endless, insatiable desire that drives every living creature, and even inanimate nature, toward a state of perpetual striving. From this premise flows Schopenhauerian pessimism. If the will is the root of all existence, then suffering is inevitable, because desire is never fully satisfied. The moment a desire is fulfilled, a new one arises, and the cycle repeats, leaving us trapped in a perpetual state of want. To illustrate this, Schopenhauer offers the simple image of a hungry animal. The animal feels an ache, a gnawing emptiness, it seeks food, and when it finally eats, the satisfaction is fleeting. The animal soon feels another hunger, another ache, and the process begins again. Human beings, he argues, are no different, only that our desires are more elaborate, our sufferings more layered. He famously declares, "Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom." The pendulum metaphor captures the existential angst that would later be echoed in the works of Camus, who would describe the absurd as the clash between a world that offers no inherent meaning and the human yearning for such meaning. Schopenhauer's bleak assessment of desire as the engine of misery provides the first secular articulation of existential dread. The universe is indifferent, and the source of our suffering is internal, not imposed by an external moral order. Schopenhauer's metaphysics, however, did not go unchallenged. Early analytic philosophers such as Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore dismissed the notion of a metaphysical will as an unfounded speculation beyond the reach of empirical verification. They argued that philosophy should focus on logical analysis and language, not on opaque metaphysical constructs. In their view, Schopenhauer's will was a poetic metaphor at best, a relic of a pre-scientific age that could not be substantiated by the emerging methods of physics and mathematics. This early analytic critique foreshadows the later 20th century split between continental existentialism and the analytic tradition, a division that still shapes philosophical discourse today. While Schopenhauer was mapping the terrain of suffering, Nietzsche was already preparing to overturn the very foundations of morality that had been erected upon it. In the early 1860s, a young Nietzsche, fresh from his doctoral work, was appointed as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in 1869, a remarkable achievement for a man who was only 24. His appointment was a turning point, not only for his career, but for the intellectual climate of Europe. Basel, with its liberal atmosphere and proximity to the burgeoning industrial centers of Germany and France, offered Nietzsche a platform from which to launch his critique of the prevailing moral order. He soon realized that the Christian morality that had dominated Western thought was, in his eyes, a life-denying force that turned the will to power, the same striving that Schopenhauer identified as something to be suppressed and guilt-laden. Nietzsche's first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, already hinted at his future rebellion, but it was in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that his radical vision crystallized. The book is presented as a series of parables spoken by the prophet Zarathustra, who descends from the mountains to proclaim the death of God and to herald the coming of the Übermensch, the overman who creates his own values. One of the most striking parables is the doctrine of the eternal return, a thought experiment that asks us to imagine living the same life, with every joy and every sorrow, over and over again, infinitely. Nietzsche asks, what if a demon were to tell you that you must live this life again, exactly as it has been forever? He does not present the eternal return as a literal cosmological claim, but as a moral test. Can you affirm life so fully that you would willingly repeat it without end? This parable forces us to confront the meaning we ascribe to our choices, to our suffering, and to the very finitude of existence. The eternal return also functions as a counter-argument to Kantian moral universalism. Immanuel Kant, in his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, posits the categorical imperative, a universal, rational principle that commands us to act only according to maxims that could be willed as universal laws. Kant's moral law is rooted in the autonomy of rational agents and presupposes a kind of moral order that transcends personal desire. Nietzsche, by contrast, sees the categorical imperative as a manifestation of slave morality, a set of values imposed by the weak to restrain the strong. He writes, all morality is a kind of prejudice. It is the result of a particular point of view and not an absolute. The eternal return, then, becomes a way of testing whether one's values are genuinely life-affirming, rather than imposed by an external moral code. If you could endure the endless repetition of your life, you have created values that are truly yours. Nietzsche's critique of morality also leads him to declare the death of God, a phrase that has become shorthand for the cultural shift towards secularism. He does not celebrate this death as a cause for despair, rather he sees it as an opportunity for humanity to re-evaluate its values. Yet the void left by God's absence, Nietzsche warns, can precipitate nihilism, a belief that life is without meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value. This nihilistic abyss is precisely what Heidegger later identifies as the nothing, a fundamental groundlessness that underlies human existence. Heidegger's reinterpretation of the nothing is not a void to be feared, but a horizon that allows authentic being toward death. In this sense, Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God becomes a precursor to Heidegger's existential analytics, and later to Camus's articulation of the absurd. Camus, writing in the aftermath of 2 world wars, would pick up Nietzsche's warning about nihilism and transform it into his own philosophy of the absurd. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus asks whether the recognition of an indifferent universe demands suicide, or whether we must instead revolt against the absurd by embracing it. He famously concludes that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. While Camus never adopts Nietzsche's Übermensch, he shares the conviction that meaning must be forged, not discovered, in a world that offers none. The resonance between Nietzsche's eternal return and Camus's absurd hero is striking. Both demand a wholehearted affirmation of life despite, or perhaps because of, its inherent meaninglessness. Returning to Schopenhauer, his influence on later existentialists is less direct but no less profound. His notion that art offers a temporary escape from the will, by allowing us to contemplate the world without desire, prefigures Sartre's idea that aesthetic experience can suspend the anguish of freedom. Schopenhauer's pessimism also informs the tone of existential angst that permeates early 20th century literature, from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground to Kafka's nightmarish bureaucracies. In each case, the protagonists confront a world that seems to conspire against authentic self-realization, echoing Schopenhauer's claim that the will is an insatiable force that blinds us to any possibility of lasting peace. The real-world applications of these ideas are manifold. Consider the modern workplace, where the relentless pursuit of productivity can be seen as a manifestation of the will's endless striving. Employees may experience a constant cycle of desire, higher salaries, promotions, recognition, only to find that each achievement spawns a new set of expectations, leading to chronic dissatisfaction. In this context, Schopenhauer's insight that the greatest of follies is to sacrifice health for the sake of wealth becomes a cautionary reminder. The will's demands can erode well-being if left unchecked. Similarly, Nietzsche's call to create one's own values can be read as an invitation to cultivate personal meaning beyond corporate metrics, to develop a personal Übermensch who defines success on his own terms rather than on the prevailing market ideology. Another contemporary illustration can be found in the realm of digital media. Social platforms are designed to tap into the will's desire for validation, offering likes, shares, and comments as fleeting rewards. The endless scroll mimics the will's ceaseless appetite. Each notification provides a brief moment of satisfaction, only to be replaced by the next craving for attention. Here, Nietzsche's warning against the herd mentality becomes salient. He writes, "The herd forgets its own freedom and loses itself in the comfort of the crowd." When users surrender their autonomy to algorithmic dictates, they risk becoming the very last man Nietzsche despised, a creature content with mediocrity, lacking the courage to create its own values. Counter-arguments to Nietzsche's relativism also emerge from Kantian ethics, as mentioned, but also from the tradition of natural law, which holds that certain moral truths are grounded in human nature itself, independent of cultural or individual preferences. Thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas and later John Finnes argue that human flourishing can be identified through rational analysis of human goods. From this perspective, Nietzsche's radical revaluation of values appears arbitrary, even dangerous, because it undermines the possibility of universal human rights. Critics contend that without a shared moral framework, society risks descending into a might makes right scenario, where the strongest impose their will without restraint. This critique resonates with the early analytic dismissal of Schopenhauer's will, but it also underscores a deeper tension. Can a secular existentialism sustain a normative ethic, or does it inevitably lead to moral relativism? The historical anecdotes surrounding these thinkers add texture to their philosophical trajectories. Schopenhauer, for instance, spent much of his career in bitter rivalry with Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. In the early 1830s, Schopenhauer arrived in Berlin, eager to lecture on his own ideas, only to find the university dominated by Hegelian idealism. Hegel's followers dismissed Schopenhauer as a provincial eccentric, and the young philosopher was denied a professorship, leading him to retreat to his family's townhouse in Frankfurt. He famously declared, "All truth passes through 3 stages. It is first ridiculed, then violently opposed, then accepted as self-evident." The rivalry never fully healed, and Schopenhauer's work remained largely ignored during his lifetime, only gaining recognition after his death when his pessimism resonated with the disillusioned generation of the 1860s. Nietzsche's own life story is equally dramatic. After his appointment at Basel, he quickly gained a reputation as a charismatic lecturer, captivating students with his passionate readings of Greek tragedy and his daring critiques of contemporary morality. However, his health was fragile. Chronic migraines, visual disturbances, and a relentless work ethic took their toll. By the early 1880s, Nietzsche began to experience severe mental breakdowns, culminating in the catastrophic collapse of 1889 in Turin, where he famously witnessed a horse being whipped and in a fit of compassion threw his arms around the animal's neck. That moment, often dramatized in biographies, is said to have marked the final rupture of his sanity. After the collapse, Nietzsche spent the remaining years of his life under the care of his mother and later his sister, unable to continue his philosophical work. Yet even in his incapacitation, his writings continued to circulate, influencing a generation of artists, writers, and thinkers who would grapple with the very anxieties he had articulated. The secular turn that Nietzsche and Schopenhauer inaugurated did not merely replace Christian metaphysics with a new set of abstractions. It opened a space for existential questions to be asked in a world increasingly defined by scientific rationalism, industrialization, and the erosion of traditional authority. Their ideas seeped into literature, psychology, and even politics. Sigmund Freud, for instance, borrowed Schopenhauer's notion of unconscious desire, reframing it in terms of sexual and aggressive drives. Freud's concept of the death drive echoes Nietzsche's will to power, suggesting that human beings are propelled not only by life-affirming instincts, but also by a destructive impulse that seeks to return to a state of non-existence. This psychological dimension further deepens the existential angst of the early 20th century, as individuals confront not only external meaninglessness, but also inner forces that seem to undermine any attempt at self-construction. In the realm of politics, Nietzsche's misappropriation by the early Nazi movement illustrates the danger of divorcing his philosophy from its nuanced context. The Nazis seized upon the Übermensch and the will to power as justifications for authoritarian domination, ignoring Nietzsche's disdain for nationalism and his advocacy for individual self-overcoming. This historical misuse serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of extracting philosophical ideas from their broader ethical framework. It also underscores the importance of the counter-argument from Kantian universalism, which insists that moral principles must be applicable to all rational beings, not merely to a select elite. The influence of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer extends into contemporary existential psychotherapy. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, for example, acknowledges the inevitability of suffering, a theme central to Schopenhauer, but proposes that meaning can be found through purposeful action, echoing Nietzsche's call to create values. Frankl writes, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." This therapeutic stance reflects the synthesis of Schopenhauer's acknowledgement of suffering and Nietzsche's affirmation of life, offering a pragmatic pathway for individuals wrestling with existential dread in modern society. Modern interpretations of Nietzsche's eternal return have found fertile ground in contemporary physics, particularly in theories of cyclical cosmology. Some cosmologists speculate about a universe that undergoes infinite cycles of expansion and contraction, a notion that, while scientifically distinct, resonates poetically with Nietzsche's thought experiment. This convergence invites a dialogue between philosophy and science, suggesting that existential questions can be reframed in light of new empirical discoveries, without losing their essential urgency. Heidegger's engagement with Nietzsche is perhaps the most direct philosophical bridge from the 19th century secular turn to mid-20th century existentialism. In his lecture series Nietzsche, Heidegger interprets the death of God as the emergence of the nothing, a fundamental void that reveals the finitude of human existence. Heidegger argues that confronting the nothing allows Dasein, being there, to recognize its own temporality and to own its being. This existential analysis of nothingness can be read as a continuation of Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism, but with a different therapeutic aim. Rather than proclaiming the Übermensch, Heidegger urges authenticity through an acceptance of finitude. Camus, in turn, picks up this thread, describing the absurd as the tension between the human demand for clarity and the silent, indifferent cosmos. Camus's declaration that the absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world echoes Heidegger's notion that the nothing is not a negation, but a space that makes being possible. The secular turn also invites us to reflect on how we, as contemporary listeners, might apply these insights. Imagine a student faced with the pressure of an increasingly competitive academic environment. The student experiences the will's endless desire for higher grades, scholarships, and future career prospects. Each achievement yields a brief sense of triumph, followed quickly by the next benchmark. In Schopenhauer's terms, the student is caught in the cycle of desire that yields only temporary relief. If the student adopts a Nietzschean stance, she might ask, "What values am I truly pursuing? Am I merely conforming to the herd of academic expectations, or am I creating a personal framework that affirms my own passions?" By confronting the eternal return, by imagining that she must relive each exam, each paper, each moment of anxiety forever, she may discover which pursuits are worth affirming and which are merely imposed. Another example can be drawn from the experience of an artist confronting the market's demand for commercial success. The artist feels the pressure to produce works that sell, while her inner drive pushes her toward experimental, perhaps less marketable, creations. The will in this case manifests as both a desire for external validation and an internal compulsion toward authentic expression. Nietzsche's critique of herd morality warns against surrendering to the last man of commercial conformity. The artist, by embracing the eternal return, might ask whether she would be willing to repeat the same artistic choices indefinitely. If the answer is no, she may choose to resist market pressures, thereby embodying the overman's commitment to self-created values. These analogies illustrate how the philosophical concepts of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche can be lived out in everyday decisions, turning abstract metaphysics into practical guides for navigating a world that often feels indifferent. The key is not to seek a final answer to the problem of meaning, an answer that both thinkers would likely deem impossible, but to engage in the ongoing process of value creation, of confronting desire, and of affirming life even in the face of its inherent absurdity. To bring the discussion full circle, let us return to the question that began this segment. How did Nietzsche and Schopenhauer radicalize existential themes beyond the Christian framework? Schopenhauer stripped away the theological veil, exposing desire as the core engine of suffering, thereby secularizing the source of existential angst. Nietzsche then removed the moral scaffolding that had been erected to mitigate that suffering, proclaiming the death of God and urging humanity to confront the abyss with creative courage. Their combined legacy is a philosophy that does not promise redemption, but rather offers a path of self-overcoming, an invitation to confront the nothing and to forge meaning in a world that offers none. This secular turn set the stage for the later existentialists, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, to explore the implications of a world without predetermined purpose and to ask how we might live authentically amid the anxiety that such a world inevitably produces. As we listen to the echoes of their thought in the modern age, whether in the relentless scroll of a smartphone, the pressure of a corporate ladder, or the quiet contemplation of a night sky, we are reminded that the existential questions raised by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche remain as pressing as ever. Their insights continue to challenge us, to recognize the will that drives us, to question the moral frameworks we inherit, to confront the possibility of nihilism, and ultimately to decide whether we will succumb to the herd or strive toward a self-crafted horizon. In this ongoing dialogue, the secular turn is not a final destination, but an open invitation to keep asking, to keep creating, and to keep living with eyes wide open to both the suffering and the possibility that lie within the human condition. The night is quiet and the mind begins to wander, tracing the outlines of a thought that has been moving through philosophy for more than a century. Imagine a dimly lit lecture hall in Freiburg, 1927, where a young Martin Heidegger, his voice low but intense, steps up to the podium and declares that the question of being sane has been forgotten, that we have been content to treat it as a mere backdrop for our scientific calculations. He asks us gently but insistently to turn our gaze back toward the world in which we find ourselves, not as detached observers but as participants, as beings who are already in the world. This is the moment when phenomenology, the careful description of lived experience, meets existentialism, the urgent inquiry into freedom, meaning, and death. It is a meeting that would reverberate through the corridors of 20th century thought, shaping the works of Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and countless others who would later speak of the absurd, of angst, of the call to authenticity. Heidegger's magnum opus, Being and Time, begins not with a definition of being, but with a description of Dasein, a German term that literally means being there, yet which Heidegger uses to denote the human being as the entity for whom being is a question. He writes, Das Dasein ist des Sein zum Tod, that Dasein is being toward death. In this single phrase, he compresses an entire ontology. We are not merely alive, we are finite, we are always already moving toward an end that we cannot escape. To understand what this means, we must first grasp his notion of being in the world. This is not a Cartesian dualism of subject and object, but a unity. The world is not a collection of things that stand apart from us. It is the horizon of significance that gives shape to our everyday activities. When I reach for my coffee mug, the mug is not simply a physical object. It is my coffee mug, a piece of a network of relationships that includes the morning ritual, the taste of bitterness, the need for wakefulness, the comfort of habit. Heidegger calls this network care, Sorge, the fundamental way Dasein is always already involved with the world. Care is not a feeling, it is the structure of existence itself. It is why we find ourselves caring about the weather, about a lover's smile, about the promise of a future project. Care is the movement that carries Dasein from the anonymous crowd that dictates norms and expectations, into the possibility of authenticity. Authenticity, for Heidegger, is not a moral virtue, but a mode of being where Dasein confronts its own most potentiality for being. It is the moment when we recognize that we are thrown into a world not of our choosing, yet we are also projected forward by our own possibilities. In the face of this thrownness, we can either dissolve into the everydayness that smooths over the anxiety of freedom, or we can stand before the abyss of our own finitude and say, I am and I will be because I choose. This choice is what Heidegger calls authentic existence. To illustrate the gravity of this choice, Heidegger offers the analysis of being toward death. Death, he insists, is not simply the biological termination of life. It is the most personal possibility that each of us must confront. It is the most possibility because, unlike any other, it cannot be shared, cannot be outsourced to another. When we acknowledge death as our ultimate horizon, we are forced to see the trivialities of the day for what they are, distractions. The authentic individual in this light does not seek to escape death, but to let the awareness of death shape each decision, each action, each relationship. This is why Heidegger writes, Nur im Bewusstsein des eigenen Ends Word, des Dasein zu seiner eigenen Möglichkeit. Only in the consciousness of its own end does Dasein become its own possibility. The language Heidegger uses is famously dense, almost poetic. He speaks of Zuerfenheit, thrownness, of Entschlossenheit, resolution, of Verfallenheit, fallenness. Critics, especially those aligned with the logical positivist tradition, have long charged him with obscurity. A.J. Ayer, for instance, would argue that a statement such as being is time is meaningless unless it can be empirically verified. From that standpoint, Heidegger's metaphysical jargon appears to be nothing more than linguistic gymnastics, a veil that hides the lack of any testable claim. Yet the phenomenological method, which begins with a return to the things themselves, resists such reduction. It insists that the structure of experience, how we feel thrown into the world, how we anticipate death, cannot be captured by the language of measurement alone. The critique, therefore, is not merely about style. It is about a deeper philosophical disagreement over what counts as knowledge. While logical positivists would demand a language of propositions that can be confirmed or falsified, Heidegger invites us to listen to the silence between propositions, to hear the echo of existence that resists quantification. Now let us turn to another figure who would take the phenomenological turn and push it in a dramatically different direction, Jean-Paul Sartre. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre declares, "L'existence précède l'essence," existence precedes essence. In other words, there is no predetermined nature that dictates what we must become. We first exist, and then we define ourselves through our choices. This radical freedom is both a gift and a burden. Sartre calls it condamné à error libre, condemned to be free. He argues that every human being is thrust into a world of facticity, the concrete circumstances of birth, history, language, body, that we cannot change, yet we are nevertheless free to interpret and act within those constraints. Freedom, then, is not the absence of constraints, but the ability to choose how we relate to them. One of Sartre's most vivid illustrations of this freedom is the famous café scene in Nausea. Picture a small Parisian café, the clatter of cups, the murmur of conversation, the smell of coffee mingling with the dampness of a rainy afternoon. The protagonist, Roquentin, sits alone, feeling a sudden, unsettling awareness that the other patrons are looking at him. He imagines a woman at the next table glancing at his face, and in that glance he experiences what Sartre calls le regard, the look. The look is not merely an observation, it is an act that transforms the observed into an object. When we are seen, we become for the other. We are no longer simply a subject of our own choosing, but an object in someone else's world. The look forces us to confront the fact that our freedom is always already mediated by the presence of others. It is a moment of bad faith when we deny this mediation and pretend that we are wholly self-determined, or, conversely, when we surrender entirely to the gaze of the other, allowing it to dictate our identity. Sartre writes, "Le regard ne se contente pas de me voir, il me rend object." The look does not simply see me, it makes me an object. Sartre's analysis of bad faith, mauvaise foi, is a cornerstone of his existentialism. Bad faith occurs when we deceive ourselves about the nature of our freedom. Imagine a waiter who insists that his role is simply to take orders, that he has no choice but to be a waiter. By reducing himself to his social function, he evades the responsibility of recognizing his capacity to transcend that role. Conversely, a woman who refuses to acknowledge the constraints of her socioeconomic background, insisting that she can simply will herself into a different life without addressing the material conditions, also commits bad faith. In both cases, the individual refuses to own the tension between facticity and transcendence, choosing instead a comfortable illusion. The radical freedom Sartre celebrates has not escaped criticism. Marxist thinkers, most notably Louis Althusser and later Herbert Marcuse, have accused Sartre of neglecting the structural forces that shape human possibility. They argue that to speak of freedom as a purely individual project overlooks the material conditions, class, labor, ownership, that predetermine the range of choices available to any person. In a Marxist reading, Sartre's existentialism is an abstraction that, while inspiring, can become a philosophical luxury for those who already possess the means to act. The critique asks, can a worker in a factory truly be condemned to be free, when the very act of choosing a different job may be impossible due to economic coercion? The Marxist counter-argument does not deny the phenomenological reality of freedom, but insists that freedom must be understood as historically situated, that authentic existence requires collective struggle, not merely individual will. Returning to Heidegger, we can see a subtle resonance with Sartre's concerns about the look, even though Heidegger never uses the term. Heidegger's notion of the they des man captures a similar phenomenon. The anonymous crowd that imposes a set of expectations that turn the individual into a mere they self. When Dasein conforms to des man, it becomes an object within the world, stripped of its ownmost possibilities. The they is, in a sense, the collective look that makes us feel as though we are being judged, measured, categorized. Heidegger writes, des man ist des, was des Dasein in seiner alltäglichen Existenz zu sein vorgibt. The they is what Dasein in its everyday existence pretends to be. The parallel is striking. Both thinkers see the social gaze as a force that can diminish authenticity, yet they differ in their solutions. Heidegger suggests a turning toward death, a confrontation with finitude, to break the grip of disman. Sartre, on the other hand, urges a conscious embrace of freedom, an acknowledgement that we are always both subject and object, and that we must continually choose our stance. To bring these ideas into the present, consider the modern phenomenon of social media. Each post, each like, each comment can be seen as a digital version of the look. When we scroll through a feed, we are constantly aware that our images are being observed, judged, transformed into data points. The anxiety that arises, the fear that we are not presenting an authentic self, mirrors Sartre's notion of bad faith. Are we in the digital age more prone to slipping into the they? Or can we, by recognizing the gaze, reclaim our freedom and use the platform as a space for authentic self-expression? The phenomenological description of this experience would focus not on the number of followers, but on the lived feeling of being seen, the tension between the desire to be recognized and the fear of becoming an object. Another contemporary illustration of Heidegger's being toward death can be found in the way we confront climate change. The looming ecological crisis presents a collective horizon of finitude that forces societies to ask, what will we become when the planet can no longer sustain us? The awareness of an impending, possibly irreversible end can catalyze authentic action, political, personal, artistic, if we allow it to shape our projects rather than retreat into denial. In this sense, the climate emergency becomes a shared being toward death that calls each of us to confront our thrownness and to choose, authentically, how we will respond. Let us now travel back to the historical moments that gave birth to these ideas. In the winter of 1927, Heidegger delivered a series of lectures at the University of Freiburg that would later be compiled into Being and Time. The audience, a mixture of theologians, mathematicians, and budding philosophers, was initially bewildered by his unconventional style. He would pause, look out the window, and ask, "What does it mean to be?" He would then draw a diagram on the blackboard, not of logical propositions, but of a simple stick figure, a man standing in a landscape, to illustrate Dasein as being in the world. The anecdote that has survived is that after one lecture, a student approached him and whispered, "Professor, you have spoken in riddles." Heidegger smiled and replied, "Riddles are the language of existence. They invite us to listen." This moment captures the tension between the clarity demanded by the analytic tradition and the poetic, phenomenological approach that Heidegger championed. Fast forward to 1945, the year that saw the first major existentialist conference in Paris, held at the Café de Flore, a place that would later become synonymous with Sartre and de Beauvoir's intellectual gatherings. The war had just ended and the city was still scarred by occupation. Sartre, fresh from his involvement in the French resistance, stood before a room of students, writers, and philosophers, and proclaimed, "El homme est libre, mais il est condamné à errer libre." He spoke of the absurdity of the human condition, the weight of freedom in a world that had just witnessed the horrors of totalitarianism. Simone de Beauvoir, sitting beside him, added a feminist dimension, insisting that freedom must be shared, that the oppression of women was a clear example of how freedom could be denied by structural forces. The conference sparked a wave of publications, debates, and eventually, the popularization of existentialism in post-war Europe and America. The image of Sartre gesturing passionately, his hands moving like the waves of the Seine, while the audience listened in hushed awe, has become an iconic snapshot of existentialist fervor. In weaving together these threads, we see a continuity that stretches back to Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish thinker who first spoke of anxiety, angst, as the dizziness of freedom. Kierkegaard wrote, "Angst is the dizziness of freedom." For him, anxiety is not a pathology but the very condition that makes choice possible. It is the trembling awareness that we could become anything, that we must choose, and that our choice defines us. This anxiety finds its echo in Heidegger's being toward death, the unsettling realization that our existence is finite, and in Sartre's condemnation to freedom, the relentless pressure to define ourselves in the face of an indifferent world. The lineage continues with Albert Camus, who, in the myth of Sisyphus, declares that the absurd is born of the confrontation between the human yearning for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe. Camus's absurdity is a cousin of Heidegger's finitude and Sartre's freedom. It is the same recognition that the world does not hand us a pre-written script, and yet we must keep rolling the stone. Camus's famous image of Sisyphus, forever pushing a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back, offers a potent analogy for the existential condition. The boulder is the weight of facticity, the hill is the horizon of death, and the act of pushing is the exercise of freedom. Sisyphus, aware of his endless task, can either succumb to despair or find a quiet joy in the very act of pushing. Camus concludes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. This imagined happiness mirrors Heidegger's call to own one's being toward death and Sartre's insistence that we must create meaning through our choices, even when the universe offers none. Another analogy drawn from the world of theater helps illuminate the interplay of freedom and the look. Picture an actor on stage, spotlighted, delivering a monologue. The audience watches, and the actor feels the weight of their gaze. The performance is a dance between the actor's inner intention and the external reception. If the actor forgets the audience, they risk becoming a mere reciter of lines, losing authenticity. If they become overly concerned with the audience's approval, they may betray their own artistic vision. In the same way, Sartre's look reminds us that we are always both actors and observers in the drama of life, constantly negotiating between self-definition and external perception. Let us now examine more closely the concept of facticity that Sartre places alongside freedom. Facticity includes everything that cannot be changed: our birth date, our cultural language, the socio-economic conditions that surround us. Yet Sartre insists that facticity does not determine us, rather, it is the canvas upon which we paint our freedom. He writes, Nous sommes condamnés à la liberté, mais nous sommes aussi condamnés à notre situation. We are condemned to freedom, but also condemned to our situation. The paradox lies in the fact that while we cannot escape the circumstances of our birth, we are nevertheless always free to interpret those circumstances and to act upon them. A concrete illustration can be found in the story of a young woman born into a working-class family in post-war France. She could have accepted the expectation that she would become a factory worker, but she chose to pursue education, to become a teacher, thereby redefining her facticity through an act of freedom. Sartre would say that her decision exemplifies the triumph of existential freedom over deterministic constraints, even while acknowledging that the economic realities of her family still shape the difficulty of her path. Heidegger, however, would caution that the very act of making such a choice is only authentic if it is made in the light of being toward death. If the woman's decision is driven solely by social ambition or the desire for status, it may still be an expression of the they. Authenticity requires that she confront the ultimate limit of her existence, that she recognize the temporality of her life, and that she let this awareness inform her choice. In this way, Heidegger adds a temporal dimension to Sartre's ethical calculus. Freedom is not a static attribute, but an unfolding process that is always situated within the horizon of death. The tension between these two thinkers also surfaces in their treatment of language. Sartre, a playwright and novelist, treats language as a tool of consciousness, a medium through which we articulate our freedom. He famously says, La parole est le moyen par lequel l'homme se projette dans le monde. Speech is the means by which man projects himself into the world. Heidegger, by contrast, sees language as the house of being. In Letter on Humanism, he writes, Die Sprache ist das Haus des Seins. Language is not merely a tool, but the very dwelling place of existence. This difference underscores their divergent emphases. Sartre focuses on the agency of the individual speaker. Heidegger emphasizes the ontological grounding of that speech within a larger, pre-existent horizon. Both perspectives, however, converge when we consider the role of the other in shaping self-understanding. Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith involves a solitary decision, yet even his leap is made in the context of a religious community that frames the possibility of faith. Camus's absurd hero, while isolated in his struggle, nonetheless finds solidarity in the shared human condition of confronting meaninglessness. In the same vein, Heidegger's being with Nietzsche and Sartre's look both acknowledge that we are never truly alone. Our existence is always mediated by other beings. This mediation is not merely a social fact, it is an existential structure that shapes how we become. To bring these abstractions back to everyday life, consider the simple act of waiting in line at a grocery store. While you stand there, you become aware of the people behind you, the cashier scanning items, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The look is present in the subtle glances exchanged, the unspoken expectations that each of us will behave politely. At the same time you are being in the world, the items on the shelves are not just products but possibilities for nourishment, comfort, or indulgence. If you notice that you are merely following the script of the day, picking the same brand, paying without questioning the price, you might feel a faint anxiety, a sense that you are not fully owning your choice. In that moment, you have an opportunity to act authentically. Perhaps you decide to try a new product, to strike up a conversation with the person next to you, to reflect on why you chose this store at all. The decision is small, yet it embodies the phenomenological tension between the they and authentic freedom. Another example, drawn from the world of art, is the painter who decides to abandon the popular style of the day in favor of a more experimental approach. The painter knows that the market, galleries, and critics, collectively they expect a certain aesthetic. Yet the painter feels a pull toward an inner vision, a form that resonates with the awareness of mortality, perhaps a series of works that confront decay and impermanence. By embracing being toward death, the painter allows the finitude of life to inform the brushstrokes, creating art that speaks to the universal condition. Sartre would view this act as an assertion of freedom against the gaze of the art establishment, a refusal to become an object of market expectations. Heidegger would see it as an authentic unveiling of being through the medium of paint. The cross-references among these thinkers deepen our understanding of existential phenomenology. Kierkegaard's anxiety, Heidegger's being toward death, Sartre's freedom, and Camus's absurd all point to a central insight. Human existence is fundamentally a tension between finitude and possibility. Each philosopher offers a different lens for examining that tension. Kierkegaard emphasizes the subjective experience of anxiety as the gateway to faith. Heidegger foregrounds the ontological structure of temporality. Sartre spotlights the ethical responsibility that arises from radical freedom. Camus underscores the paradox of seeking meaning in a world that offers none. Together, they form a tapestry that stretches across the 19th and 20th centuries, each thread reinforcing the others while also revealing unique patterns. In contemporary philosophy, this tapestry continues to be woven. Existential phenomenology has influenced thinkers such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose focus on embodiment expands Heidegger's being in the world to include the lived body as the primary site of perception. Likewise, feminist existentialists like Simone de Beauvoir reinterpret Sartre's freedom through the lens of gendered oppression, arguing that women are often forced into bad faith by a patriarchal they. The dialogue between these traditions shows that the mid-century explosion of ideas was not a closed chapter, but a springboard for ongoing inquiry into how we experience, choose, and relate. Let us pause for a moment and consider the practical implications of these ideas for our own lives. When we confront a major decision, whether to change careers, to end a relationship, to move to a new city, we are faced with the existential weight of freedom. Sartre would urge us to acknowledge that there is no predetermined path, that we must choose and then own that choice. Heidegger would ask us to recognize that the decision is made in the shadow of our mortality. That by confronting the possibility of death, we sharpen the clarity of what truly matters. The look of friends, family, and society will inevitably be present, shaping the context of our decision. To act authentically, we must navigate between the pull of the they and the call of our own most possibility. In the realm of politics, the existentialist call to authenticity can become a powerful catalyst for social change. Consider the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Activists, aware of the look of a hostile majority, chose to assert their freedom in the face of oppression, embodying Sartre's notion of radical freedom. At the same time, they confronted the finitude of their lives. Many faced imprisonment, violence, even death, yet they embraced being toward death as a source of resolve, refusing to be reduced to the they that the dominant society imposed upon them. Their struggle illustrates how existential phenomenology can move beyond abstract theory into lived, collective action. Conversely, the Marxist critique of Sartre's individualism reminds us that freedom cannot be fully realized without addressing structural inequalities. A society that denies basic needs, food, shelter, education, places a hard limit on the range of authentic choices available to its members. The dialogue between Sartre and Marxist thinkers thus becomes a dialogue about the conditions under which authenticity can flourish. It asks us to consider, can we truly be free if we are forced into survival mode? The answer may lie in a synthesis, where Sartre's emphasis on personal responsibility is paired with a commitment to transform the socio-economic structures that constrain freedom, a project that both existentialists and Marxists might endorse. To close this segment, let us return to the image of the café, that humble stage where Sartre first articulated the look. Imagine the clink of cups, the soft murmur of voices, the faint smell of espresso. In that ordinary setting, profound philosophical insights emerge, reminding us that philosophy is not confined to ivory towers or dense textbooks. It lives in the everyday moments where we become aware of ourselves as both subjects and objects, where we confront the inevitability of death, where we recognize the weight of our freedom. Heidegger's being in the world and Sartre's existence precedes essence are not abstract doctrines to be shelved. They are invitations to listen to the quiet undercurrents of our lived experience, to ask ourselves, am I living authentically, or am I merely drifting with the they? They ask us to consider, Do I acknowledge the look of the other, and if so, do I allow it to shape me, or do I let it pass without surrendering my freedom? In the final analysis, the fusion of phenomenology and existentialism in the mid-century was not a simple merger of two schools, but a dynamic conversation, a dialectic between description and prescription, between the structures of experience and the call to freedom. Heidegger offered us the map of our existential terrain, the cliffs of death, the valleys of care, the horizons of authenticity. Sartre handed us the compass of freedom, pointing toward the ever-shifting north of responsibility, warning us of the seductive pull of bad faith and the relentless gaze of the other. Together, they charted a path that continues to guide philosophers, artists, activists, and anyone who has ever stood in a cafe, felt the weight of another's stare, and wondered what it means to be truly alive. So, as you listen to the echo of their words, let the pause between sentences become a space for reflection. Feel the texture of the world beneath your feet, the breath of your own finitude, the tremor of your freedom. In that quiet, perhaps you will hear, as Heidegger suggests, the call to own your being toward death, and as Sartre whispers, the reminder that you are condemned to be free. And in that convergence, you may discover, as Camus would say, the possibility of happiness even in the absurd, the chance to roll your boulder with a smile, knowing that the act itself is the meaning you create. The story of the absurd begins, perhaps, with a simple question that haunts every human heart. Why do we persist in seeking meaning when the universe offers none? Albert Camus, the French-Algerian writer whose voice rose from the rubble of occupied France, answered that question not with a definitive solution, but with an invitation to stare unflinchingly at the void, and to find within that stare a kind of freedom that is both terrifying and exhilarating. In his seminal essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes, "There is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." He does not suggest that we should end our lives, but that we must confront the possibility of meaninglessness head-on, and that the act of confronting it is itself an act of rebellion. Imagine, for a moment, the ancient Greek king Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a massive stone up a hill, only to watch it tumble back down each time he nears the summit. The punishment is endless, the task absurd, and the outcome predetermined. Yet Camus asks us to picture Sisyphus smiling as he pushes the stone, to see in that smile the triumph of consciousness over futility. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he declares, and in that simple, almost paradoxical sentence lies the core of his ethical project. The absurd hero does not escape the absurd, he embraces it, and in doing so, he creates his own meaning through the very act of rebellion. Camus's rebellion is not a violent uprising against a tyrannical state, although he certainly wrote passionately about political oppression in The Rebel. Rather, it is a metaphysical rebellion, a refusal to surrender to the silence of the cosmos. In The Rebel, he expands the notion of rebellion from the personal to the collective, arguing that the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become unfree ourselves. This paradoxical statement captures his belief that true freedom is not the ability to do whatever one wishes, but the capacity to recognize the limits imposed by the absurd and to act responsibly within those limits. He insists that rebellion must be bounded by a respect for the other, that it cannot descend into nihilistic destruction, because to do so would be to betray the very humanity that makes the rebellion possible. The ethical implications of this stance are most starkly illustrated in Camus's novel The Stranger. The protagonist, Meursault, drifts through life with a detached indifference that unsettles everyone around him. When he kills an Arab on a sun-blistered beach, he does so not out of malice, but because the heat, the glare, the absurdity of the moment overwhelm his senses. At his trial, the prosecutor does not focus on the act of murder itself, but on Meursault's failure to conform to societal expectations of grief and remorse. "I open myself to the gentle indifference of the world," Meursault declares, and in that confession we hear the echo of Camus's absurd hero, a man who accepts the world as it is, without the comforting veil of moral illusion. But Camus's articulation of the absurd has never been without its critics. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist whose philosophy of radical freedom and responsibility dominated mid-20th century thought, accused Camus of evading the responsibility that consciousness entails. Sartre argued that by declaring the absurd as an immutable condition, Camus denies the freedom to transcend the given. For Sartre, consciousness is always a project of self-creation, a continual act of choosing that affirms one's existence. Camus, in contrast, seems to suggest that consciousness can be a passive witness to the absurd, that we can simply recognize it without being compelled to act beyond the limits it imposes. This tension between the two thinkers raises a profound question. Does acknowledging the absurd absolve us of the duty to shape our own essence, or does it merely illuminate the stakes of that very duty? The debate deepens when we turn to the post-structuralist critique, particularly that of Jacques Derrida. Derrida, whose work on deconstruction exposed the instability of language, saw the absurd not as an ontological condition, but as a linguistic fissure. In his essay, The Gift of Death, he writes, "The absurd is the trace of the impossible within the possible." For Derrida, the absurd is not a static backdrop against which human drama unfolds, but a perpetual slip in the signifying chain, a reminder that any attempt to fix meaning is always already haunted by its own impossibility. From this perspective, Camus's rebel is caught in a web of language that both constructs and deconstructs his freedom. The rebel's act of defiance is thus always already mediated, always already ambiguous. This critique does not diminish Camus's insight, but it reframes it. The rebellion is not a clean break from the absurd, but a continual negotiation with the very words we use to describe it. To understand why these philosophical quarrels matter, we must look beyond the ivory towers of academia and see how Camus's ideas have seeped into everyday life. In psychotherapy, for instance, the existential therapist Irvin Yalom draws directly on Camus's notion of the absurd to help patients confront the givens of existence. Yalom writes, "When we accept that life has no ultimate meaning, we are freed to create our own stories, however fleeting." In a therapeutic setting, this acceptance becomes a tool for patients grappling with depression, anxiety, or a sense of purposelessness. By encouraging them to acknowledge the absurd, therapists help them to reframe their suffering as a space for authentic choice rather than a void of despair. Political activism, too, bears the imprint of Camus's rebellion. Consider the anti-colonial movements of the 1950s and 60s, where activists, faced with the absurdity of imperial domination, chose to resist not because they believed in a guaranteed victory, but because they could not accept the moral void of passive acquiescence. Camus himself, writing for the French resistance newspaper Combat during World War II, embodied this stance. He reported on the atrocities of the Nazis not with grandiose rhetoric, but with a stark, unembellished clarity. The absurd is the only reality that can give us the strength to say no. His wartime journalism, filled with concise, urgent dispatches, demonstrates how the absurd can become a catalyst for concrete, courageous action, even when hope seems absent. The legacy of Camus's thought also resurfaces in contemporary popular culture. In the 2019 film Joker, the titular character, Arthur Fleck, spirals into a world that feels indifferent and hostile, echoing Meursault's detached observation of the world's gentle indifference. The film's final scenes, with the clown's chaotic dance through a riotous crowd, serve as a visual metaphor for the absurd hero's dance on the edge of meaninglessness. Similarly, the television series The Good Place uses humor to explore moral philosophy, and its later seasons grapple directly with the idea that the universe may be indifferent, prompting characters to create meaning through their relationships, a modern, comedic echo of Camus's Sisyphus pushing his stone. Returning to Camus's own life, the 1957 Nobel Prize controversy offers a vivid anecdote about the public reception of his ideas. When the Swedish Academy announced Camus as the laureate, many intellectuals, including Sartre, protested, arguing that Camus's moral stance during the Algerian War, where he advocated for a civil truce rather than full independence, betrayed his commitment to universal justice. Sartre's public letter declared, "Camus has taken a position that is morally untenable." Yet Camus's response, measured and reflective, emphasized the necessity of rebel conscience that does not abandon the other. The episode underscores how the absurd, as a philosophical concept, can become a flashpoint for political and ethical debate, testing the limits of intellectual solidarity. The tension between Camus's acceptance of the absurd and his rejection of existentialist freedom is perhaps best understood through an analogy. Picture a sailor navigating a storm-tossed sea. An existentialist might argue that the sailor can chart any course, that the horizon is a canvas for limitless imagination. Camus, however, would say that the sailor must first recognize the sea's indifference, its endless waves that will not cease because the sailor wishes them to. The sailor's rebellion, then, is not to command the sea, but to steer his vessel with skill and dignity, knowing that the storm will not be tamed, only endured. In this way, Camus embraces freedom as the capacity to act responsibly within the constraints of the absurd, rather than as an unbounded power to rewrite reality. Camus's notion of revolt without hope resonates with the modern existential crisis of climate change. Scientists warn that the planet is approaching irreversible thresholds, a reality that can feel absurdly hopeless. Yet activists from Greta Thunberg to the youth-led Fridays for Future movement embody Camus's rebellion. They act not because they are certain of success, but because they refuse to surrender to the indifferent forces of ecological collapse. Their protests, their strikes, their demands for systemic change echo the Sisyphusian push, each petition, each march, a stone rolled up a hill that may, in time, roll back down, yet the very act affirms human dignity in the face of an indifferent cosmos. In literary terms, Camus's influence extends to the post-existential wave of writers who grapple with the absurd through fragmented narratives. The Japanese author Haruki Murakami, for example, often portrays protagonists who drift through surreal landscapes, confronting the absurdity of modern life with a quiet, almost resigned humor. In Kafka on the Shore, the character Nakata, who cannot remember his past, embodies the absurd hero's acceptance of the unknowable, yet he continues to act, searching for lost cats, guiding others, because, as Camus would say, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. Murakami's work, while stylistically distinct, carries the same ethical imperative: to find purpose in the act of living, even when the universe offers no grand script. The philosophical lineage of Camus also reaches back to Søren Kierkegaard, whose concept of the leap of faith prefigures the absurd hero's willingness to act without certainty. Kierkegaardian despair, the realization that the self cannot be fully understood, mirrors Camus's absurdity, yet Kierkegaard proposes faith as a resolution. Camus rejects that resolution, insisting that the absurd cannot be solved by belief, only by revolt. This divergence highlights a crucial point in the history of existential thought. The absurd is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived with, a perpetual tension that fuels both anguish and creativity. From a phenomenological perspective, Martin Heidegger's analysis of being toward death offers another cross-reference. Heidegger argues that authentic existence arises when one confronts the inevitability of death, thereby freeing oneself from the they-self. Camus's absurd hero similarly faces mortality, but he does so without the promise of transcendence. He does not seek to escape death through authenticity, he simply acknowledges it, and in that acknowledgement, he finds the courage to continue pushing his stone. Both thinkers, therefore, locate freedom in the face of finitude, yet Camus's ethics remain grounded in a solidarity with the other, a moral dimension that Heidegger's analysis sometimes sidelines. The practical application of Camus's rebellion can be seen in the field of education, where teachers increasingly adopt existential pedagogy to help students grapple with meaninglessness in an age of information overload. By presenting literature like The Stranger alongside contemporary case studies, such as the ethical dilemmas posed by artificial intelligence, educators encourage learners to confront the absurd head-on, to ask, "What should I do when the world offers no clear answer?" This pedagogical approach mirrors Camus's own method. He used narrative, philosophy, and journalism as tools to make the abstract tangible, to transform the absurd from a distant concept into a lived experience. Even in the realm of technology, the absurd finds a strange home. The rise of algorithmic recommendation systems creates a digital echo chamber where meaning is reduced to clicks and likes. Users may feel an underlying emptiness, a sense that their choices are predetermined by opaque code, a modern, technological version of Sisyphus's hill. Some digital activists, however, respond by creating open-source platforms that prioritize user agency, embodying Camus's rebellion against the indifferent mechanisms that shape our lives. Their work suggests that the absurd can be a catalyst for innovation, a reminder that we must constantly negotiate the terms of our freedom in the face of systems that appear indifferent. Camus's own refusal to align fully with either existentialism or absurdism as a rigid school of thought is evident in his later writings. In The Fall, the narrator, Clements, confesses his moral hypocrisy, revealing that the absurd can also be an internal, psychological state, a self-imposed exile from authenticity. Camus's exploration of guilt and self-deception adds depth to his earlier claim that the absurd is an external condition. It suggests that the rebel must also confront the internal absurdities of his own conscience, a notion that resonates with contemporary discussions of moral injury among veterans and first responders. By acknowledging that the absurd can reside within, Camus expands the scope of rebellion to include personal honesty and self-accountability. The post-structuralist critique, particularly Derrida's deconstruction of the absurd, invites us to see language itself as a site of rebellion. When Camus writes, "The absurd is the essential feeling of the human being confronting the world," he uses a metaphysical claim that Derrida would argue is always already mediated by the very words that attempt to capture it. Yet this mediation does not nullify Camus's insight. It underscores the paradox that any attempt to articulate the absurd is itself an act of rebellion against silence. In this sense, poetry, music, and visual art become vessels for the absurd, each medium offering a different way to push the stone without ever reaching a final summit. Consider the visual arts. The painter Francis Bacon, whose distorted figures convey a sense of existential dread, can be read as an artistic counterpart to Camus's philosophy. Bacon's canvases, with their raw, unsettling textures, depict bodies caught in moments of crisis, echoing Meursault's moment of shooting on the beach. The viewer, confronted with such images, experiences a visceral recognition of the absurd, an awareness that the world can be both beautiful and brutally indifferent. Bacon's work, like Camus's prose, does not offer a solution. It simply holds up a mirror to the human condition, urging the observer to respond, to rebel, to find meaning in the act of witnessing. The resurgence of existential motifs in popular culture, from video games like The Last of Us to music albums such as Radiohead's OK Computer, demonstrates how Camus's ideas have permeated collective imagination. In The Last of Us, the protagonist Joel must decide whether to sacrifice a young girl for the sake of a potential cure, a decision that forces him to confront the absurdity of hope in a world ravaged by a fungal pandemic. The game's narrative forces players to consider whether rebellion, risking everything for a cause that may be futile, is ethically justified. This mirrors Camus's own dilemma. To act in the face of absurdity, even when the outcome remains uncertain, is an ethical imperative that transcends the boundaries of philosophy and enters the realm of lived experience. The question remains, does Camus's rebellion require hope? Camus would answer with characteristic paradox that hope is not the engine of rebellion, rather the awareness of its absence fuels the fire. He writes, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. Hope, then, is not a belief in a positive outcome, but a commitment to the act itself. This idea resonates with contemporary movements that adopt a prefigurative politics approach, organizing societies based on the values they wish to see, not waiting for an eventual utopia. By acting now in the present moment, activists embody the absurd hero's push, refusing to wait for a promised resolution that may never arrive. Sartre's critique that Camus denies consciousness can be reframed as a dialogue rather than a contradiction. Sartre emphasizes that consciousness is always a project of self-definition, whereas Camus emphasizes that consciousness can also be a witness to the absurd without the pressure to constantly redefine itself. In therapeutic contexts, this distinction matters. Some patients, overwhelmed by the pressure to constantly improve themselves, find relief in Camus's invitation to simply observe the absurd and act authentically within that observation. Others, inspired by Sartre, feel empowered to actively reshape their identity. Both perspectives offer valuable tools, suggesting that the philosophical debate enriches, rather than diminishes, our understanding of human agency. The post-structuralist perspective adds yet another layer. If the absurd is a linguistic fissure, then rebellion is an act of resignifying, a constant rewriting of meaning. This aligns with contemporary digital activism, where hashtags become rallying cries that reconfigure public discourse. The Me Too movement, for instance, can be viewed as a collective rebellion against a language that had long silenced survivors. By naming the abuse, participants create a new narrative that challenges the absurd silence surrounding gendered violence. Camus's insistence that rebellion must respect the other finds a modern echo here. The movement's emphasis on solidarity, on listening to each other's stories, reflects the ethical dimension of rebellion he so passionately defended. Historical anecdotes about Camus's life illuminate how his philosophy was not merely abstract. During the Nazi occupation, Camus worked as a journalist for Combat, a clandestine newspaper that risked the lives of its contributors to disseminate truth. One of his dispatches, written in a cramped basement, reads, "We are not here to glorify the heroics of war, but to expose its absurdity." His words, smuggled across occupied France, served as a beacon for those who felt powerless, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the act of bearing witness is a form of rebellion. The very act of writing, of turning ink into resistance, embodies the Sisyphusian push, each article a stone, each distribution a step toward an uncertain summit. When Camus received the Nobel Prize in 1957, the world celebrated his literary achievements, yet the controversy surrounding the award highlighted the political stakes of his philosophy. Critics argued that his refusal to take a firm stance against French colonialism in Algeria betrayed the moral clarity demanded of a Nobel laureate. Camus responded, "I have always been a man of the present, not a man of the future." His reply underscores the tension between the timeless nature of the absurd and the temporal demands of political engagement. The episode reminds us that the absurd does not dissolve ethical responsibility, it reframes it, urging us to act without the illusion of guaranteed outcomes. In contemporary psychotherapy, the existential approach influenced by Camus is gaining traction in dealing with existential dread among older adults. Researchers have found that when patients are guided to confront the absurd, recognizing that life's end is inevitable and that meaning is not pre-given, they often report a heightened sense of agency. By embracing the absurd, they shift from a passive resignation to an active creation of personal narratives, a process Camus would describe as the revolt that gives life its dignity. This therapeutic model demonstrates how philosophical concepts can translate into tangible mental health interventions, offering a bridge between abstract thought and lived well-being. The legacy of Camus also persists in the realm of ethics, particularly in debates about artificial intelligence. As machines become increasingly capable of making decisions, philosophers ask whether we are creating a new form of absurdity, entities that operate without consciousness yet affect human lives profoundly. Camus's insistence that rebellion must be rooted in respect for the other becomes a guiding principle. We must design AI systems that acknowledge the inherent dignity of human beings, even when the underlying algorithms appear indifferent. In this way, the absurd becomes a lens through which we evaluate emerging technologies, urging a rebellion that safeguards humanity against the cold logic of machines. To bring the discussion full circle, let us return to the image of Sisyphus. Imagine him not as a tragic figure doomed to endless labor, but as a symbol of the human capacity to find purpose in the process itself. Each ascent, each breath of effort, is a moment of conscious defiance against the universe's silence. Camus's message, then, is not that we must abandon hope, but that we must redefine hope, not as a promise of a better future, but as a commitment to the present act of rebellion. In this redefinition, the absurd becomes a fertile ground for creativity, ethics, and solidarity. When we consider Meursault's Indifferent Murder, we see a man who, stripped of social pretense, confronts the world with raw honesty. His lack of remorse is not a moral failing in Camus's view, but an illustration of the absurd hero's refusal to feign meaning where none exists. Yet Meursault's trial reveals society's demand for fabricated meaning, for rituals that mask the absurd. The courtroom becomes a stage where the absurd and the social order clash, and Camus uses this clash to expose the limits of conventional morality. The lesson for us today is clear. When institutions demand conformity to an illusory narrative, rebellion, quiet, steadfast, without the promise of victory, remains the ethical response. The dialogue between Camus and his critics, between his literary imagination and his political activism, continues to reverberate across disciplines. Whether we are reading The Myth of Sisyphus in a philosophy class, discussing The Stranger in a literature circle, or applying Camus's ideas in a counseling session, we are invited to ask ourselves, how do we live authentically in a world that offers no ultimate justification? How do we rebel responsibly, honoring the other while acknowledging the absurd? And perhaps most importantly, can we find within the endless push of our own stones a quiet, steady happiness that does not depend on external validation? In the end, Camus does not provide a tidy answer. He offers a call to awareness, a demand for courage, and a promise that the very act of confronting the absurd fills the heart. As he writes, the absurd man is he who is aware of the limits of his existence and yet does not surrender. That awareness, that refusal to surrender, is the rebellion that carries us forward, stone by stone, toward an ever-rising horizon. It is a rebellion without hope of a final triumph, yet it is a rebellion that affirms life precisely because it knows life offers no guarantee. In embracing this paradox, we step into the lineage of Sisyphus, Meursault, and countless others who have chosen to push, to write, to speak, to act, knowing that the absurd will always be there, but also knowing that our response to it defines who we are. Thus, as we close this exploration of Camus's absurd, rebellion, and legacy, let us linger on the image of the stone rolling upward, the desert sun beating down on the indifferent beach, the quiet newsroom where words become resistance, the courtroom where society confronts its own pretenses, and the modern activist standing before a climate-raging sky. Each of these scenes, each of these moments, is a reminder that the absurd is not a wall that ends our story, but a doorway that invites us to step through, to create, to rebel, and to find in the very act of rebellion a meaning that is ours alone. And in that meaning, however fleeting, we discover the quiet, enduring smile of Sisyphus, the steady breath of the rebel, and the timeless echo of Camus's voice, urging us onward, ever onward, into the bright, indifferent light of existence.